Welcome to week 2 of Brush Lettering and Watercolor with Jess Park. I hope you guys have been practicing your brush lettering. Today we're going to go ahead and go over watercolor. So we're just talking about the very basics, what supplies you need, and how to get started with the different techniques. So let's start with paper. Strathmore has a ton of different types of paper, and I like to stick with anything that's 140 pounds. So really quickly, the way you can find that is just, you can see it on the cover, and these are all ones that I like to use personally as well. So these are small sizes that you can travel with. And then for larger pieces, of course, they do make different sizes like this, and this comes wire bound, and then also they have their block. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. So now let's talk about paint. When you go to the store, you're going to see tons of different choices and you might feel overwhelmed. But since you're just starting out, I would say try to stick to something closer to student grade. And then when you feel more comfortable with painting and you decide you want to stick with it, then you can upgrade to an artist grade paint. So I like to buy my own palette and then buy the paint that comes in tubes and then squeeze them into my palette. And that's just a personal choice. So now let's talk about brushes. When you go to the store, you may notice, just like with paint, there's tons of different brushes out there and you may feel quite confused on what to get. So I like the round tip brushes, and the reason is that they can get, even the big ones like this, they can get really thin details if you use a tip, and then if you push down on them, you can get broader strokes. These I also like to use. This one is a wash brush, and I like to use that sometimes for washes. And we'll talk about what a wash is later. And this is a flat shader that I like to use. It has a flat tip and the bristles are quite stiff, so I like to use that for splatter. And we'll talk about splatter later. So some of the other things you're going to need, obviously you're going to need some water, so you can keep that in a jar or any type of container that will just hold water. You want something that's fairly large so that you don't have to keep washing it out and rinsing it out. Another thing you're going to need is a rag or a paper towel, and we'll talk a bit about why you're going to use that later. And then an optional thing that you might use is painter's tape, and the reason is sometimes if you're using a lot of water on your paper, you'll notice it'll start to wrinkle up, and you can use the painter's tape to just tape it down so that it's not going to do that. And some miscellaneous things you'll see on the handout that I gave you, we can talk about a little later. So let's just go ahead and get started. The first thing you want to do is get your palette, and you're going to wet the paint, and that just helps the pigments to be a little more vibrant when you use them. If you use them straight from the palette without wetting them, you might notice that your paint is a little more dull, and you might have a hard time getting like a nice consistency. Alright, so let's start just by getting to know your brush. So let's start with a round tip brush, and what I'm going to do is just get a little paint. Well, first get your brush wet, and your paint was already wet. So rather than using it straight off of the palette like this and then onto your paper, just mix it around on your palette. And get a nice consistency that you like. And I may have put a little too much water here, but that's okay. And anytime you use too much water, that's what that rag or paper towel is for. Alright, so let's see what this brush can do. So this is a round 10, but you'll see that I can get really fine lines with it. I can push down and get a wider stroke like this. And just play around and see what your brush is capable of. And the way that I'm going to do this is by changing the angles, by changing the pressure, and just see what your brush can do. And you can push really hard down like this, get like some dry brush strokes. And the more you do this, you'll get more familiar with your brush and see what it can do. So that was around 10. And then here is around 6. And you'll, I mean, from company to company, all the brushes are quite different. The sizes are not universal, so just try the one that you have out and see what it can do. And once you've played around and feel comfortable, then we can move on. And if at any point you feel I'm going too quickly, go ahead and pause your video, rewind it. And by playing with your brush, not only are you getting a feel for what the strokes that you can make, but also kind of how much paint you need to make a specific type of stroke, if that makes sense. So here I'll see, okay, I needed more paint there if I wanted to make it fill it all in, versus if I wanted a dry brush stroke like that. So I hope that makes sense. All right, so let's move on. Now let's get started with the techniques that you see in your instructional sheet. I'm using the 400 series watercolor block, and the reason is that it helps the paper from getting all warped. So it's glued on all 4 sides, and then there's a little notch at the top, and that's how you would separate the paper when you're done. Now Strathmore has a really nice instructional video on how you would take the paper off once you're done with it, so you can go ahead and check that out on their website. So let's start with the very first technique, and that is the wet on dry. This is probably the one that you're going to use the most. And basically wet on dry means you're using wet paint on dry paper. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get my brush wet and choose the color of paint that I want to use. And again, I'm not using it directly from here. I'm moving it over and mixing to find a consistency that I like. And a color that I like as well. My brush is loaded, and what I'm going to do is just paint a rectangle. And you'll see I'm going to get a little more paint and a little more water there. Okay. So with the wet on dry, you'll notice that you get these crisp edges. You can go over it. And that's as simple as it gets, just the wet on dry. Okay, so next what we're going to do is the wet on wet. So like the name implies, basically you're using wet paint on wet paper. So get some clean water on your brush, and what you're doing is just painting a rectangle with water. And I've got a little leftover paint on my brush, but that's okay. Alright, so my brush is loaded with paint, and what I'm going to do is just touch, and you'll see that the paint just spreads. And this is a really fun technique. So where this one was really the wet on dry, is pretty easy to control where you want your paint to go. You can see that the wet on wet is harder to control. It's more unpredictable, but you do get these softer edges. So that is the wet on wet. Okay, moving on, let's do the dry brush technique. So rinse out the paint from your brush that you just had. And then this is where that rag or paper towel comes in. You're gonna use it to take the water off of your brush. You want to be gentle with the bristles, It's not a completely dry brush because you still want to be able to move the paint around. So, but for the most part, it's pretty dry. It's just some green that I had mixed earlier. Okay, so for a dry brush technique, I'm going to go ahead and just put some strokes. And you'll see the more I use it, and it's cool, it creates like this fun, neat texture, and depending on your paper, I guess is depending on the texture of the paper is kind of what you're going to see when you use a dry brush. Washes are what you use to when you're covering like a large portion of your paper. So this might be like if you're covering or painting a sky scene or landscape, or even if you're doing some brush lettering and you want some like a nice colorful background, the washes are what you're going to use. So the very first wash is called a flat wash. And basically you're using one color and you're covering covering one area. It could be the hardest wash only because it might be hard to keep that nice flat consistency. So I'm gonna paint, or I'm gonna pick a new color, so I'm just gonna get some of this. Make sure my brush is wet, pick up some of that blue, and I'm just gonna mix it in here. So the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to tilt my paper up just a little bit so that gravity can work with me here. And I'm just going to paint side to side and then go down. And then if you run out of paint, just get some more. Now here's the key. If you run out of paint, you don't want to dip your brush back into the water because that is going to affect the flat wash. Anytime you add water, you'll see it'll create like a new texture. So that is a flat wash. Now, if you use a little too much water, or if your paint was really wet, and then you put the paper down like this, you'll notice it'll start to kind of bleed back here. So if that's the case, just hold your paper up like this, and then what you can do is kind of dab a little of the water off of your brush and then pick up the water that pools down here. So basically with the flat wash, the less you touch it, the better. And we're going to go ahead and move on to a graded wash. So graded wash is really pretty. It kind of looks like a ombre, I guess you would say, where it starts out dark on one side and then it lightens as you move down. And I'm just doing that same thing that I always do, like taking a wet brush and then just picking up the paint. That looks pretty to me, so I'm going to stop here. And there's a few ways you can do this, so I'm going to show you 2 ways today. So the first way is you have the paint loaded on your brush. You go ahead and paint a strip like this. And then you take this brush and you're going to rinse it just a little bit. I basically what I did was just dipped it in water once. And then bring it back, and you'll notice that you diluted some of that, and keep doing that. Dip it again, and I'm just gonna bring it back, dip it again, and you'll see as the paintbrush loses color, it gets a nice graded wash. And then at the end you might just completely wash out your brush. So that's one way to do it. And then here's the other way. You load your paintbrush with paint, and again my paper is tilted so gravity can help bring the paint down. So that, so I loaded my paintbrush and I painted a big strip right here. I'm going to take this paintbrush, wash it completely out. And that was different from the first way we did it, where all we did was dip the brush. But this time we completely wash it out, and so I have no more paint on my brush. And then I'm going to start from the bottom with just the water until it meets the top. Now if you do this too slowly, your paint would have dried and you would have created a hard edge, which you don't want. And then you'll see that it slowly kind of just brings it down. And you can leave that, or if you want to make it smoother, then you can just keep going over it all the way to the top, and that kind of smooths it out. Okay, moving on to the variegated wash. And to that, I'm going to add some purple. Let's try a little more water here. Let's put a little more blue. So that is a variegated wash. And you'll notice that at the bottom here, I used a little more water, so then the paint will kind of seep in a little more. And then right here, I didn't use as much, and it kind of stays in place. So you kind of play with it and see what type of effect you're going for. Another way you can do a variegated wash is just to mix your paint directly onto the paper, and it doesn't have to be straight lines like I'm doing here. And that is still a variegated wash. So let's start with lifting. So I've got my wet paintbrush here, and then, my clean paintbrush here. And what you're going to do is make it into a thirsty brush. And the way you do that is you just take as much water off of it as you can, just like how you did with a dry brush technique here. And so once you've got a thirsty brush, it's just looking to pick up water or pigment or whatever. So let's start with this variegated wash, and mine's still a little damp, and so I'm going to show you what it would look like if I lifted damp. So you can see it, and you can rinse off your brush every time you touch if you want to. That it picks up the paint. And that is one way to lift. Another way would be to lift dry. This top portion is dry. And you'll see that this blue that I created was easier to lift when it was damp than it was when it was dry. Now, layering. To achieve this, basically what you need to do is put down a layer of paint, and then when it's completely dry, you add another layer of paint. So pretty simple. So here it's pretty dry up here. And I'm just layering it on top. And some colors will layer really well, and some of them won't. And again, it's just the type of pigment that the paint is made out of. You might have one yellow that will layer over everything, and then another one that's weak and you just can't see it. Next, let's talk about textures. So adding different textures is always kind of a fun thing to do. And let's paint a new block here. So just pick any color and paint a new block here, so we can look at what it looks like when you add water to slightly damp paint. Now, if you add it to really, really wet paint versus slightly damp paint versus dry paint, you're going to create different textures. So here I've got, on this side is pretty wet right here, and then over here is a little less. Okay. So what the water does is it kind of dilutes the paint, and you can see it in that picture in the instructional sheets. So here I just, like I said, on this side is pretty wet. So if I add water, kind of dilutes the paint out, versus adding it to this area, which is a little drier. You'll get more distinct circles. All right, so let's go ahead and add some alcohol. What I'm going to do is take this just regular rubbing type alcohol, put on a cotton tip swab, and you'll see it'll repel the water. Now you can do it like this, you can put it on an old paintbrush and just splatter it on. You can put on an old toothbrush and splatter that, and we'll talk about splatter in a second. Okay, so we did the alcohol, and next we're going to go ahead and use salt. So salt will absorb the water. You can here put a big chunk of it, or you can try using just regular like Morton salt, and experiment, see what you like best. It also reacts differently if you add it to super wet paint versus almost dry paint. So play around and see what you like. And so with the salt, you put it on the paper and you have to allow your paper to dry, and that can take up to, 10, 20, 30 minutes depending on how much water you have on your paper. And then once it's completely dry, you just brush the salt off. So those are just a few things you can use to add texture to your paintings. And you can try and see what else you have and see what other textures you can make. So one thing I forgot to include about lifting is you can use different things to lift your paint, and that will create new textures as well. So here I've just got a rag, and earlier I used a brush, and when you use a rag and that was super wet, you can get something like that where it's just kind of like a blob. But if you use it on that, like what I said earlier, where it's kind of dry but you still see a shine, then you can create a kind of fun texture with it. And you can see all the little different dots of the terry here. And then another way to create texture is just using plastic. If you wrinkle it up and then just stick it on and leave it, and this is such a small area, but if you did it on a larger area, it looks pretty cool. You can leave it for, a few seconds, and that creates a new texture. Or you can let it dry and then lift it, and that creates a new texture as well. So we're going to let this salt dry, and then I'll show you. And while we're waiting for it to dry, let's talk about splatter. So splatter is always really fun, and it's pretty messy and unpredictable. So what you're going to do is make your paintbrush, or wet your paintbrush, and I'm going to just grab this green and mix it into here. Okay, so you want to load your paintbrush with the paint so that it's going to drip onto your paper. So I'll show you a few different ways you can achieve this. Bigger splatter, you can use larger paintbrush. And what you do is you just take it and you can either tap it with your finger, or you can take something like another paintbrush and you can do something like that. And here I'm using just a stiff bristled brush. So this is what this brush looks like. And this method that I'm doing now, can be pretty messy because you're going to have to use your fingers. So I'm just holding it against my finger and then I'm going to run my finger up. And that is another way. You can use a toothbrush or you can use different sized paintbrushes. Let's check on our salt and see how it's doing. So I removed some of the salt crystals. There's still some on the side, but you'll see that it absorbed it. And then, so that's one texture it can make, but also you can see on the instructional sheet, in your instructional sheet, you can see it also can create crystal-like shapes. So just play around with it and see what you like best. Next, I'm going to go ahead and show you some projects you can do with the techniques that I've just taught you. So here's a really easy one, and it may not look like it, but basically what you're doing is just painting circles. And this was a wet on dry technique here, but you can also see that I've used like a combination of a wet on wet kind of variegated wash. And so how I do that is I'll paint one circle here and then let this one touch the very edge and then it bleeds into it, and that creates that variegated wash look. So that's something you can create with just the techniques that you learned. And here is another one. And the way I created this is just by painting it with masking fluid. So that's how I got the white lines. But what I want you to pay attention to here is just the layering technique. So you can see some of the colors, when you layer them on top of each other, you can see them more clearly. And here it was a wet on wet technique. So I had a wet paper and I just added paint to it, and that created this this water-like pattern. And what I did was I dropped water on it, and so you can see where I dropped the water and it created these cool textures. And so this is what I was talking about, where you can create a background and then letter over it. And then to create a galaxy, you use the same wet on wet. So you wet your paper and then add different colors to it to let them, and that's the variegated wash as well, where it kind of blends in together. And then I just splattered some white paint on there. And here's one last example where I used the variegated wash, and you can see where the pink and this dark purple kind of blend together. And then I layered on the black. So even though those techniques may have seemed really easy today, you can combine them to create really beautiful pieces that are complex. And go ahead and practice that this week, and then next week we're going to move on to flowers and leaves and cactus. All right, have a great week.